Hello everyone and welcome back to another bombastic barrage of Barter in the Booth. This episode recounts my experiences at the 2019 Rugby World Cup in several different cities across Japan. Due to its outrageous length, it will be serialised into two parts, this being the first and the remainder coming next week. It's called Nihon Ganbare. In 2015, the greatest sporting event to ever grace the earth came to England. I felt so proud that the nation I call home was to finally play host to players and supporters from across the globe in a raw spectacle of strength, speed, passion, aggression and camaraderie, the likes of which only the Rugby World Cup can boast. Although I had just started university and was being bombarded by feelings of fear, doubt and excitement, images of 2003 ran riot in my head. Could England fulfil the dreams of every fan in the country? Could they keep the Webb Ellis Cup on English soil? No, they fucking couldn't. They crashed out of the group stages in the most depressing anticlimax since the Kooks second album. Ever since, the words Rugby World Cup had sounded shrill in my ears and tasted bitter in my mouth. Even with Eddie Jones galvanising a fresh England squad into 2 Six Nations titles, I'd shut off any internal countdown clock until the next global competition. It was only when I applied to work in Japan that I realised if I was successful, the stars would align and I would again be able to witness the tournament on home turf. My determination to emigrate was suddenly kicked up a gear. I was now facing the prospect of ramen, onsen, karaoke and the Rugby World Cup being on my doorstep. It was a turbulent journey, but by hook or by crook, I found myself gearing up for possibly the most exciting month of my life. What better way to soak up the atmosphere of the opening match, I thought, than to pull on my Japan rugby tee, the replica jersey was £100, and wander down to the Kumamoto fan zone. Although my city was only hosting 2 games, the fan zone was open most days for the big matches. I was alone, but in the rugby community, you're only a hearty verse or blurted profanity away from a friend. The screen was big, the beer was cold, the meat was smoky, and the girls knew their back foot from their back row. Other ideas for this sentence were lock from their line-outs, sidestep from their sin bin, and grubber from their Gary Owen. Naturally, it didn't take long for me to bump into some of my club mates from the Kumamoto Sundays. Before I knew it, pints were being passed around like peanuts, and my support for the brave blossoms became increasingly vigorous. "Roll away, you Russian cunt!" was a highlight of my in-match analysis. One of the upsides of living in a country where no one speaks English is that you can get away with saying pretty much whatever you want. I could have been yelling out the recipe for a steak and kidney pie and no one would have questioned it. After a stirring 80 minutes of top-class rugby, our boys had earned a bonus point victory and, like the Russians, I was battered. By now, some of my fellow Gaijins had joined me, and being the only non-Japanese people in the crowd, we were swarmed on by every media outlet there. In one interview, I offered an in-depth analysis on the Japanese victory, and on the other, I chopped a pint in under 4 seconds. I have attempted to track down the footage, but to no avail, probably for the best. Despite my work commitments the following day and my best efforts to remain civil, I was swept up in the fervour of Japanese victory. The next thing I knew, I had a glass of imeshu in one hand, a microphone in the other, and was salvaging Danny California from the butchery of one of my club mates. Why is it that the person that ropes you into a duet always sings with about as much gusto as a mouse with strep throat? I've lost count of the number of times I've been badgered into singing a disgustingly overrated song, only to carry the damn thing single-handedly. This is not what 4 years of operatic training was for. Still, the unexpectedly loose nights are always the funniest, and I thoroughly enjoyed raising the curtain on the World Cup in Japan with a bang. I awoke the next day feeling suspiciously sprightly. This was handy as it was the day of my school's cultural festival. Sulking was not an option. Cultural festivals are a huge deal in Japan, and this was to be the product of weeks of tireless work from both students and staff. Energised by a hearty breakfast of smints, I was excited to finally sink my teeth into what they had to offer. My only point of reference was the old school British school fete, so naturally my standards were low. Boy was I wrong. There's no better cure for a sore head than a revitalising brew-up, which was lucky because I quickly remembered I'd accidentally agreed to attend the 10 a.m. tea ceremony. Now I thought us Brits took particular care in preparing our chai, but now the thought of clicking on a kettle and chucking a bag in a mug makes me feel like a savage. I sat there, dead behind the eyes, sweating and shivering like a crackhead, whilst over 1,000 years of tradition and immaculate etiquette played out in front of me. An arsenal of potions, powders, cauldrons, strainers, bamboo ladles and cups were utilised, culminating in a small bowl of green tea. It could have been the sense of occasion, or perhaps the fact that I was about to collapse of dehydration, but this concoction certainly had some life-giving properties. Either way, I was thirsty for more culture. The first major event of the day was the school band in concert. Once again, my experience with school bands at home left much to be desired. I was expecting 7 kids vaguely tooting the theme from Robin Hood, Prince of Thieves. What I was not expecting was a night at the fucking proms. A 50-strong squad of musical prodigies expertly guided me through big band anthem after big band anthem. They kicked off with Sing Sing Sing, and the energy kept coming through Arabian Nights and Zimmer's Pirates of the Caribbean score, as choreographed routines and audience participation peppered the music just the right amount. My socks had well and truly been knocked off. Next up was the taiko performance. I regret exhausting my arsenal of hyperbolic language on the orchestra because it was one of the most incredible and intense spectacles I've ever seen in my life. A literally stunning explosion of raw energy, skill and passion. My words will never do it justice. At the show's climax, I overheard an exchange student behind me utter the words, "I think I'm going to cry." I wholeheartedly agreed. I've played the drums for 10 years, and in half an hour these students shattered any grasp I thought I had on percussion. Taiko shows are becoming increasingly accessible, with touring teams selling out theatres around the world. If you ever get the opportunity to see one, do it. It's an experience that will stay with you for the rest of your life. If the taiko was a fiery vindaloo, the singing concert was a cool mango lassi. Violin recitals, piano duets and choral singing further showcased the school's depth of musical talent, a soothing end to a busy day's culture. Unfortunately, English class tends to bring the shyness or indifference out of a lot of students, and having only seen them in and around the classroom, I'd had the impression that these were typical teenage students. They had been so kind and welcoming since day one, but I had never seen them out of their regimented routine, and was worried that rigorous schooling had filed away at their personalities. Little did I know I'd been working in the presence of some of the most talented young people I've ever had the pleasure of meeting. Remember at school there might have been one kid who could play the piano, or one kid that could sing quite well. Here I realised that every single student was bursting with creativity and passion. I wandered up to the art and design floor and was gobsmacked at the pieces on display. Paintings, calligraphy, costume and fashion that would not at all look out of place in a London gallery or Milan's Fashion Week. A lot of this work was done by 15-year-olds. Even the students that weren't involved in a particular club activity had written and directed short films, performed comedy sketches, or transformed classrooms into carnivals. I felt so privileged to share in all their hard work and dedication and catch a glimpse of the real people behind the homework. Living in a Japanese city somewhat more off the beaten track, such as Kumamoto, I never really grew accustomed to seeing other foreigners out and about. The expat community here is a drop in the ocean, and since most of us are involved in teaching in some way or another and tend to frequent the same watering holes, it doesn't take long to become familiar with the community. If I've had a bad day, the constant stares from the locals can tip me over the edge, but if I caught a glimpse of a 6'5" white guy strutting through the centre of town who I hadn't met, better know I'd be staring. So you can understand my astonishment when my out-of-the-way, understated, some might even go as far as to say rural city became overrun with rowdy Frenchmen. Of course, I knew they were coming. France were to play Tonga in the first of 2 matches hosted by the city, but that still didn't quite prepare me for the reality. Now, as an Englishman, it's in my DNA to hate the French. You don't spend an entire millennium warring your neighbour without there being some residual animosity, even if that does boil down to exchanging slurs about frogs and roast beef across the garden fence and the odd naval dick measuring contest in the Channel. But the uniting philosophy of rugby, coupled with being 6,000 miles from home, made the Legion of Blue Shirts a welcome sight and the usual unbearable pong of garlic tolerable. It's like the old idea that humanity will only fully unite once we're invaded by aliens. When in the wildly unfamiliar landscape of Japan, the cultural chasm between England and France suddenly shrinks to the point of triviality. The match was taking place on Sunday, so the Saturday was spelt crammed into the fan zone, absorbing the fixtures that were happening elsewhere in Japan and knocking back pints and meat on sticks. A few mates from my infamous day in the honkers were in town, and it didn't take long before the overpriced beer was converted into sweaty embraces and stories of battles past. I hadn't been in Japan long enough to start missing home, and the Rugby World Cup was just another month in the general whirlwind that I had been tossed into. It's only now that the dust has settled and I glance back from my third year that I understand what a rare and profound opportunity it was to reconnect with the world that I left behind. My experiences playing rugby in Japan has been a mixed bag. The moment I landed, I put the feelers out for the best team in my prefecture, and the Kumamoto Sundays soon welcomed me with open arms. But despite their best efforts to accommodate me, I struggled with the team's ethos, which varied so much from the near homogenous rugby culture that exists in the rest of the world. There was no shortage of talent, but the sporadic and unsociable training times, the lack of real direction, the absurdly convoluted matchday itinerary, the absence of meritocracy in favour of seniority, all coupled with my inability to articulate myself fully, often made the frustration of playing outweigh any enjoyment I derived from it. The first season I joined, I contributed to the team reaching the Kyushu final for the first time in their 40-year history. It remains a fond and honourable achievement, but the exasperating hoops I'd been forced to jump through along the way meant it had the volume turned down. I mentioned earlier about having a jolly old evening with some clubmates at the opening of the fan zone, but little did I know that this was a freak occurrence. Wherever I've been in the world, rugby has always been the cornerstone of my social life. However important they were at the time, matches fade from memory and score lines become trivial, but the family I've built and the off-the-field experiences we've shared along the way will stay with me until the day I die. This fraternity has not only been a source of immensely outrageous fun, but has also blessed me with an invaluable insight into the diverse mixture of people and places that I've been lucky enough to be surrounded by in my playing career. I was so ready to continue with this social immersion in my new home, but that camaraderie so unique to rugby seldom extended off the pitch, and I found that lack of social bonding really sapped my motivation to break bones on the paddock. A recent invitation to represent the Yomitan Beach Boys Sevens side, made up of professional and semi-professional players from across Japan, quenched my desperate thirst for some high-level competition and boisterous japery. But, unfortunately, our tournaments and matches are few and far between, so as much as I yearn for the next opportunity to play together, it will remain a rare treat. During these brief spells of being around the rugby community, I felt like a weight had been lifted from my shoulders. Suddenly I found I wasn't censoring my personality and treading on eggshells for fear of being shunned from polite society. They're a sensitive breed, the expats in Japan. You'd assume that a job that involves packing up your life and moving to the other side of the world to teach would attract robust adventurers and charismatic characters. But instead you tend to get a weird Venn diagram of resentful, deluded, introverted, virtue signalling, incel, softcocks. I'd liken the community in Kumamoto to Freshers' Week at university. Everyone's desperately trying to reinvent themselves and radiate an energy which is so obviously forced. The difference is, once the novelty of freshers fizzles out, the majority of people revert back to their true selves and swiftly begin weeding out those who they regard as dickheads and recruiting those who they regard as friend-worthy. Here, that cringy, superficial smokescreen never seems to settle down. So we don't so much as interact with people as interact with meticulously constructed fronts, which makes building genuine friendships near impossible. But the community is so small that we're essentially forced into tolerating subpar relationships with people we'd ordinarily avoid like the plague, or condemn ourselves to miserable reclusiveness. Thankfully, I'd found enough of a pocket of good company to not go insane, but our existence here is finite, so as quickly as you make solid friends, they expire, and you're back to listening to conversations about how someone's fucking pug is a Gemini. God, I'd miss the company of the sort of spirit that rugby attracts. As E. Cummins wrote, "They speak whatever's on their mind, they do whatever's in their pants. The boys I mean are not refined, they shake the mountains when they dance." On the surface this may appear loutish, obnoxious and toxically masculine, but it's also passionate, loyal, and, most importantly, mine. Allez le bleu! Allez le bleu! Bellowed from the mob as we spilled out of the closing fan zone and into the streets and bars of the city centre. It was surreal and slightly unnerving to see the inconspicuous watering holes I pass on a weekly basis suddenly jammed to the rafters with boozy activity. I felt a little like I was hosting a house party, keen to join in the frivolities, but paranoid about the carpet. Remember, this city was the home of my job, my friends, and my life. not just collateral damage in some Frenchman's holiday. But my paranoia must have subsided, because the last things I remember were being line-out lifted against Asterix de Gaulle in the middle of the road, then passing out in a plate of charhan. The fan zone the following morning was a sight to behold. I don't believe a collective noun for hungover Frenchmen has yet been coined, so let me suggest one. La Regrette of Frenchmen roamed the artificial grass like a pack of zombies, cautiously nursing pints with their shaky hands in a desperate attempt to psych themselves up for the reason they were there. I too was ropey, but after wolfing down a tray of yakisoba and topping up my blood alcohol, I began to be able to walk in a straight line without retching. I don't recall much from the match itself, which is a testament to its captivation rather than a slight. After an early French lead, a valiant second half fight back by the Tongans brought them within touching distance of a monumental upset, but the men in blue held out and scraped their way into the quarter-finals by a couple of points. As much as I enjoy both an underdog victory and a French defeat, it was conducive to the evening's frivolity that the mob was victorious. Either side of the 80 minutes, I was struck by an immense sense of pride at the efficiency and conduct of the Kumamoto volunteers. Shepherding tens of thousands of drunk and boisterous rugby fans around a city that may as well be Pluto is no mean feat, but the logistics ran like clockwork and ensured maximum enjoyment with no man left behind. The concept of omotenashi had been the cornerstone of Japan's successful bid to host the now infamous 2020 Olympic Games, and at the Rugby World Cup too, this Japanese philosophy of hospitality was palpable in every bow, smile and high five. It was strange. I was surrounded by people in the midst of their bucket list, a relatively lucky few for whom this adventure might well be the highlight of their lives and will almost certainly never happen again. I was a mile from my house. I was equally caught up in the World Cup fervour. Let's not forget, for me this was no incidental event and a lifelong dream that I will cherish until my last breath. But I'd be lying if I said I didn't envy the crowd around me, who were also experiencing that overwhelming awe of Japan, which can only be conjured by your first visit. However, I was able to soak up the atmosphere in a way that very few people on Earth could, as a cultural amphibian who was not only fulfilling a once-in-a-lifetime ambition, but experiencing it from the perspective of a local. In parallel, I felt the pride of being at home and the excitement of being away. I couldn't help but feel a tad smug at people's reactions throughout the tournament when I told them that the land that for this month became their Mecca was my everyday. Post-match, we yet again took over the streets of the city centre. Tall banquet tables had been laid out to accommodate the pints and elbows of the visiting fans. The 2-day plus bender was clearly taking its toll, but high off victory and jet lag, the French and I trundled on, exchanging songs and stories in drunken Franglish, fighting every fibre of our being not to bring up William the Bastard, Napoleon, the Duke of Wellington or Nigel Farage. Oh, if only Madame Nathan could have seen that her hours of classroom toil were not in vain. My recollections of the remainder of the evening once again descend into a blurry soup of pints, darts, karaoke and arguments about fishing rights in the channel. Suffice it to say, I called in sick the next morning. The following weekend it was the turn of the Welsh to hold governance over Kumamoto. Now, as an Englishman, it's in my DNA to hate the Welsh. You don't spend an entire millennium warring your neighbour without there being some residual animosity, even if that does boil down to exchanging slurs about sheep and chariots across the garden fence, and the odd political dick-measuring contest at the ballot box. But the uniting philosophy of rugby, coupled with being 6,000 miles from home, made the legion of red shirts a welcome sight, and the usual unbearable pong of sheep semen tolerable. The Saturday was once again spent in boozy anticipation for the following day's match. As night drew in, the fan zone was painted red in every sense. At some point, a drunk to the point of being catatonic Shane Williams emerged, much to the delight of the crowd. Being a national sporting hero out on the source must be deadly, especially when everyone around has no idea that they're paying £8 for a pint. An elephant who'd just eaten an entire wheelbarrow of pork scratchings couldn't have consumed pints as quickly as Shane was accumulating them. I wouldn't have wanted to be him in the morning. This time on match day, I was to be on the opposite side of the logistical fence, as a volunteer in the fan zone. My brief was simple: wander around and be an approachable white face for the legion of leak-loving drunks to confide in. To begin with, the state I'd gotten into the night before made me regret my philanthropy, but interacting with the fans really was a rewarding experience. I'd once stood quietly at a urinal in Cardiff in the aftermath of an English Six Nations victory as a Welshman calmly explained that he planned to wrap a glass around the first man he heard utter the Queen's. so it was refreshing to see so many dragon-painted faces light up when I opened my mouth. A highlight was rescuing a poor Japanese volunteer as she tried to explain the complexities of the matchday transport to a pack of boozy valley boys in need of logistical advice. They were perfectly mannered, but Japanglish and Welsh accents are not known for their easy comprehension, and the combination of the two is comically unproductive. I clocked the situation from afar and swooped in like a divine intervention. The frazzled girl gazed up at me like her guardian angel, and after summing together my Caucasianness and uniform, proceeded to thank me like I'd rescued her baby from a burning building, and scarpered. My booze-eroded brain too fell victim to the trickiness of the Welsh's bilingualism. On the bus to the match, I overheard the couple next to me enjoying what seemed to be a normal English conversation, but much to my horror, the sentences were devoid of all meaning in my ears. There were certainly diphthongs and words that I'd heard before, but strung together they became incomprehensible babble. For fuck's sake, I've had a stroke, I thought to myself, before quickly realising that they were slipping in and out of, and at some points amalgamating, my mother tongue and their own. I felt conflicted as the bus belted out Delilah. My tribalist chimp brain recoiled, for this was the anthem of the enemy, of those that threatened to glass my countrymen at urinals. But I am, and always have been, a sucker for the gruff tones of Tom Jones. A muttered line here and there soon became an unrestrained bellow of perfect harmony. I blame it on the omotenashi. During the match, my friend and I sat next to someone's lost and senile, paralytic and foul-mouthed grandpa. Every 6 seconds he'd squawk one line of Land of My Fathers before trailing off into a mumble. He was dressed as some deranged Highlander, complete with a kilt, which, much to our amusement, was unbolstered by underpants. The match was a whitewash against a mediocre Uruguay side, so I was thankful to have Grandpa mad bollocks to keep things entertaining. From the moment the final whistle sounded, it was a mad rush back into the city to catch Japan battle Scotland for a place in the quarter-final. The fan zone hit capacity, I imagined, before we'd even left, so every bar with a TV became a sardine tin of rowdy support. Despite 99% of the sardines being technical Brits, you could count the number of Scotland fans on one mangled hand. A Japanese victory would mean a place in the last 8 for the first time in their history, and it was impossible not to be caught up in the national pride that had taken over the city, and rally around the home side with rigour. Hearing Nihon Ganbare come out of a pissed Welshman was like hearing Danny Dyer speak Elvish. Japanese people probably made up less than 1% of the bar's population, but by the gusto of the support, you'd think you were in a Tokyo rugby club. Despite a nail-biting comeback from the Scots, Japan managed to cling on to their early lead and make history on home turf. Every bar in the city erupted in ecstasy that soon overflowed onto the streets, much to the bewilderment of the rugby-illiterate locals who had just popped out for a quiet pint. I couldn't help but marvel at the power of sport. Here they were, tens of thousands of them, complete strangers, 6,000 miles from home, in a rural city in southern Japan, who, for one night only, collectively decided to invest their souls into the victory of a team made up of players whose names they couldn't even pronounce. I'd wager half of them didn't even know what city they were in, but that night they became its heartbeat. They also pissed in the street and tried to fuck anything with a pulse, so I can't get too ahead of myself. They were Welsh after all. Then, as quickly as they had arrived, the horde departed. The fickle gaze of the sporting world moved on, and Kumamoto returned to its status as a sleepy city in Japan's forgotten south. The adventure for me, however, was just warming up, as I too looked to follow the tournament beyond the prefecture's borders. I remained in Kyushu, but the neighbouring city of Oita would be my destination the following weekend, for 2 quarter-final matches that were guaranteed horn lockers, England versus Australia and Wales versus France. Friday was spent in Fukuoka, a halfway point between me and Oita, and the biggest, most happening city in Kyushu. I was linking up with 3 dear pals from Hong Kong for the weekend. Leaving them had been a dagger in my heart, and 18 months later, the prospect of a debauched reunion left me salivating like a peckish Doberman. First on the agenda was costume shopping. If we were going to watch the mighty Blighty spank the Aussies at a World Cup quarter-finals in Japan, God almighty we weren't going to skimp on the occasion. As many of you who live in your mother's basement and have never felt the loving touch of a woman will know, Japan has a rich cosplay tradition, so we had an arsenal of raucous, racy and borderline racist outfits to select from. A conference ensued, in which each man made his case for our prospective attire. It was like Yalta. After a lengthy and fierce bout of intellectual ping-pong, we settled on the Japanese schoolgirl, complete with knee-high socks and the most promiscuous of blonde wigs. As 4 rugby players of robust stature, it was going to be a sight to behold. With the important task completed, it was time to start getting acquainted with Fukuoka's naughty side. To line the stomach for the evening's antics, we accidentally dined at some sort of KKK appreciation restaurant. We were attracted in by the craft beer selection and rowdy atmosphere. Before we entered, the name seemed fairly innocuous: Cotton Fields. I know those of you at home listening are probably tearing out your hair under the weight of the cultural insensitivity implied by that name, but living in Japan you really do become desensitized to the mostly random and nonsensical English words and phrases you see splattered around the country. You haven't laughed until you've seen a decrepit rice farmer born in the 1930s with the phrase "Carnival Pussy Jesus" across his breast. It was only when I entered and set eyes on a decor whose vibe I can only describe as Confederate that the name suddenly became a wee bit sinister. Incredible selection of IPAs though. So, well hydrated and with a strange desire to gun down a man in a theatre, we flagged a sherbet dab and set a course for the nearest karaoke temple. Now, the word karaoke back home conjures up images of fat blokes in dilapidated estate pubs howling "No Woman No Cry" from their baccy-stained lungs. But in Japan, karaoke is a professional endeavour. These institutions are kitted out with private rooms, often themed, with customisable sound and lighting, costumes, novelty microphone options, room service, everything to make the average pisshead feel like a star. It's not uncommon for punters to spend evenings there completely alone, fulfilling their childhood dreams of stardom whilst enjoying the complimentary ice cream bar. But despite Japanese karaoke parlours offering a more genteel experience, we would of course be respectfully declining in favour of a traditionally rowdy affair. Upon arrival, I discovered that I was short a phone, which irked me greatly, not because of the horrendous inconvenience caused by losing a phone in this day and age, but because I pride myself on not being the sort of careless wank who loses a phone on a night out. After a frantic spell surveying every inch of the 10 yards we'd covered since exiting the cab, I was faced with a decision: condemn the glorious weekend to one of techno-reliant deflation, or phone down to reception demanding as much gin as their stoutest porter could carry, cue some anthems, and leave the box of circuits in God's basket. Believe in the Lord Jesus Christ and you will be saved. About 3/4 of the way through the place's stock of booze and Elton John's back catalogue, we received word that the phone had been found by the taxi driver and had been left at Tenjin Police Station for safekeeping. My mood quickly switched from consolidatory to celebratory, which bore no actual relevance to the rate of my consumption, win or lose on the booze. It was to mean a painful retrieval detour in our already frantic morning, but that was future Harry's issue. Present Harry was giving a note-perfect rendition of She's Electric with his top off. And once the chassis is out, it's always a steady decline into sketchy clubs, shots of sticky liqueur, pelvic-led dance moves, and arguing with strangers about the Falklands. The 4 horsemen of the Fukuoka apocalypse. We stumbled into our hotel room just in time to hear our alarms go off. The others were blessed with some time to gently vegetate, slip into their outrageous attire, and prepare for battle, but my carelessness had convicted my morning to one of stressful wheezing and viscous perspiration. I frantically threw a bag together and dived headfirst into a cab, doing everything in my power to avoid the sun's morning kiss. I informed Drive of my destination, and he chuckled unsurprisingly. Ever since I touched down in my new home, I tried desperately to integrate and swerve the brand of big, rowdy foreign tit, but it seemed this weekend, aside from the occasional flurry of basic Japanese and a rudimentary grasp of the train system, I had no option but to embrace and wallow in my Philistinity. I was petrified as I staggered into the police station. The Japanese have a penchant for bureaucracy, and I envisaged hours of Kafka-esque administration procedure in horrendous Japanglish before being told that they were unable to hand over my phone because I couldn't tell them my grandmother's blood type. In reality, my exchange with the young constable at the desk went something like this. Good morning. Last night I left a black iPhone in a taxi and was instructed to come here to retrieve it. The constable pulls out a box of 12 phones and hands me one matching my description. Is this it? She asks. Yes, I reply, whilst rifling through the phone trying to find a photo that will prove my ownership and not lead to me being arrested. Okay, goodbye, she says, with eyes that scream, why are you showing me selfies? I'm not going to fuck you. Something told me I wasn't the first drunken Burke that had crossed her path that shift. In reality, I'm certain there was more professionalism, but I was just so flabbergasted to have walked into a Japanese government institution and emerged 10 minutes later with exactly what I came for. I felt like I'd ridden into wartime Berlin on a mule and disposed of Hitler with a sharp cucumber. I might start losing my phone more often. The only thing more embarrassing than standing in Hakata Station at 8 in the morning dressed as a Japanese schoolgirl is standing in Hakata Station at 8 in the morning not dressed as a Japanese schoolgirl when the rest of your mates are. God bless the poor attendant who saw me enter the bogs as a regular chap and emerge as an extra from a low-budget transsexual porno, like a contestant on a crackhead Stars in Their Eyes. The station's eateries were yet to open, so our breakfast consisted of the somewhat infamous famichiki. As anyone who has visited Japan or East Asia in general will know, the convenience store is the lifeblood of the nation. They exist as omnipresent beacons of sustenance for prince and pauper alike, fulfilling needs ranging from the most primitive and animalistic to the most advanced and convoluted. There isn't a sticky situation imaginable that can't be solved by the vast miscellanea of goods and services they offer. It doesn't matter if you've scuffed your Oxfords on the way to a job interview or you've woken up in the gutter with shat pants, the Konbini welcomes you, without judgment. It is the paid bill of the hectic housewife, the cheap luncheon of the destitute student, the sly tin of the functioning alcoholic, the hurried breakfast of the hungover rugby fan. Between securing power for your home and disposing of recently soiled underpants, there was the hot food counter, a glowing Pandora's box of golden brown nourishment, and the incubator of the illustrious famichiki. This crispy, juicy slab of deep-fried matter is the glistening jewel in the Konbini crown. Its nefarious calorific content and perfect marriage with booze has made it synonymous with a certain wayward lifestyle and elevated it to a near UNESCO level of cultural significance within the expat community. During the boozy haze of my induction weeks, one of the first Japanese phrases etched into my cranium was "Famichiki futatsu." Like a chimp, I learned if I uttered this magical combination of fricatives and monophthongs, my hunger pains would subside. But even in that period of starry-eyed naivety, guilt peppered my words like I was ordering anal beads or a landmine, so perhaps its infamy is well earned. But I challenge even the snootiest owners of the most sophisticated palates to turn their nose up at a cold tin of premium lager and a couple of lukewarm famichikis, enjoyed perched atop the steps outside whilst flicking through one of the numerous mammary-themed Konbini publications on a clammy Kyushu evening. Utter bliss. Wolfing them down on the train platform was not quite as charming, but we had a longish journey to Oita, and we needed to line our guts for all the Asahi we'd bought. Most people making the same journey were of our ilk. Accommodation around Oita had sold out quicker than Kiyostama, and Fukuoka was the next logical stepping stone. We'd bought our costumes in such a frenzy that I'd neglected to acknowledge just how much attention they'd attract. You'd assume rugby fans, just behind those in the drag industry, would be most desensitised to seeing burly men dressed as loose women, but our presence caused a considerable stir. The reactions varied, from the predictable wolf whistles and shouts of "How much love?" to the quite bizarre, vloggers sticking cameras in our faces and Japanese locals physically handing us their babies for photographs. It's a testament to Japan's safety and naivety that when someone sees a 6'5" bearded man dressed in a miniskirt and knee-highs who's piss drunk at 8 in the morning, their immediate thought is, he should meet my infant child.